I want to talk about something which is actually on the topic of fascism. Because I was on YouTube right before I went to bed, and I saw this British documentary on the rise of Nazi Germany and the early years and the 30s of Hitler. And I was just curious about what they were going to say and how they were going to even make sense of that. This liberal British whatever. So I clicked it and I was skipping through it and watching it. And it is kind of a quagmire to think about the contradictions of how the bourgeois liberals are fascinated with fascism and how bourgeois consciousness articulates fascism in versus communism, for example. And I wanted to share these thoughts with you because I think it's so relevant, because with Kanye and with X promoting Hitlerism and lionizing Hitler and making Hitler seem like he's so cool, and you could see with this British liberal documentary that same level of like fascination with Hitler is there, even among these ostensibly anti-fascist liberals. I mean, they have a same degree of fascination. And I want to kind of get to the core of it and think about how Nazism was a counter-revolution against Bolshevism, and how the Western mind has made sense of that, from liberalism to now the kind of new Zoomer neo-Nazism we're seeing. Right? And, you know, what struck me the most about that documentary was how much of an emphasis they would place on the fact that under Nazi Germany, individuals were seen as part of a collective. And every Sunday, instead of having family dinners, they would go to great mess halls, and it would all be collective, and there was a great feeling of solidarity. And it was like everyone was a part of something, and the individual was suppressed. And I was thinking to myself this whole time, but Nazism was extremely tame when it came to collectivism in comparison to communism. If that is horrifying and fascinating you liberals, I wonder how you would fucking feel about what they were doing in the Soviet Union. Because they were trying to children were being indoctrinated with political ideology and singing. And I was just like, this is why when right-wingers try to say that communism is worse than Nazism, they oftentimes get away with it. Because by the logic of how liberals are receiving Hitlerism, they are setting up communism to be worse. The liberals seem to be fascinated with the notion of social change in general. The fact that there was a so-called totalitarian societal transformation, which there wasn't under Nazism, but the aesthetics of one were definitely there. The appearance of one, I should rather say. And liberals, for some strange reason, they cannot even process what happened with the Bolshevik Revolution, which was much more radical, much more transformative when it came to society. It's literally like a Kantian thing. It's an unnameable, totally incomprehensible outside that is beyond the threshold of their ability to rationally comprehend. And what I find disturbing about American consciousness, to be frank, is that it seems like for them, there's a spectrum of totalitarianism. And the first introduction they seem to have to totalitarian collectivism is Nazism. And there was always this peculiar, strange thing, even in the 30s in America, where the American mind would lump in fascism with Soviet communism. Oh, that's just this weird partisan collectivism. And it is so important that we be mindful of how dangerous this pipeline is, where it's much easier for people who come from an ordinary kind of consciousness, when they get radicalized, to go straight to Nazism rather than Marxism or communism. It's much easier. And that's because it's very strange. This puzzle is the one we need to solve to win in the West. Not in the East, in the West. To win in the West, we have to crack this code of how to solve this problem, because this is exactly what it was. Weimar Germany was already on a trajectory to the dominance of socialism or the workers' movement by default. And there was Bolshevism to the east, and it was exerting tremendous pressure societally, but the right-wing reaction was such that there was a filter. Bolshevism became an object of fascination and terror. What happened in Russia in their revolution was not beyond the threshold of comprehension for the majority of Russian peasants, who already lived communal village ways of life. Now in the cities, there was something, that was the breakdown of the traditional feudal relations. I mean, that was already in and of itself a huge transformation. What ended up happening in Russia is they kicked out all the aristocrats and nobles and the capitalists. They just kicked them out. They kicked them, they swept them, they kicked them out, and the people were left to build a state and a civilization, not necessarily from scratch, but definitely one that was the dictatorship of the exploited, the masses, the people. The majority, right? A popular state. And in Germany, there was this way the right and the reaction would depict Bolshevism, not as we're going to kick out the elites and the ruling class and just take the reins of power and just steer the ship ourselves, but more along the lines that this nefarious Bolshevik force and plot is going to violently uproot everyone at the most fundamental level of life and lead to bloody terror. And it's just the same, the fear-mongering of the French Revolution. It's similar. And there was this established bourgeois society in Germany which did not know how to comprehend this ultimate object of fear, which was Bolshevism. Just sheer terror. A huge portion of German anti-Semitism was a traumatic response to Bolshevism, and the way they could cope with Bolshevism is by blaming it on the Jews. Because at least the Germans knew Jews. At least Jews were somewhat familiar to them. Bolshevism was like this extremely alien thing from the East that was totally incomprehensible to their mind. So one of the ways they coped with that trauma is by giving it a Jewish face. That made it more familiar, at least. No less terrifying and whatever, but at least a little more familiar, and at least it's an enemy we can defeat, and so on for them. People need to understand something. There was nothing interesting about the collectivism under Nazism. That was rather seamless for the majority of Germans. That was stolen from social democratic traditions that were not alien, that were not these radical changes or anything. Those were compromises made in order to allow the regime to avoid being immediately overthrown by the workers. They smashed the labor unions, they jailed them, they beat them through terror and violence. They crushed any semblance of workers' power. And I remember this fucking documentary was like, oh, and Hitler, he built the Autobahn and shit. And I was like, but the Autobahn was a thing from Weimar Germany. So the real essence of Nazism is not what these British liberals are trying to say it was. Oh, collective solidarity. That was seamless. The majority of German workers were not individualists. They're working in factories. They're living in communal settings. That is not something fascinating. It's not something big and profound. Only for the bourgeoisie, that's the case. You need to understand that. That's the bourgeois perspective. That's not the workers' perspective. And I tried to think, what really then is the essence of Nazism? What made Nazism a new thing that was distinct? And the truth is, the real evil of Nazism, in my view, was that it was this intrusive kind of psychosis where there was no fundamental changes at the level of ownership. There were no fundamental changes at the level of the underlying logic of production. There were no fundamental changes at the level of the organization of society or even sovereign political power. Germany was never really a democracy. The real thing was, it was this reign of terror, counter-revolutionary terror, and the principal thing was the intrusiveness, the constant state of LARP, so to speak. It was a constant and uninterrupted state of excitation, subjective excitation, where intrusive symbolism and slogans and shouting, it's constantly happening unendingly. And that is portrayed in the fascist ideology as somehow revolutionary. Kind of like forced LARP. Forced performativism. That's the most thing that you could characterize it by. The terrifying thing, I think, which really makes it evil and sick, is that the justifying derangement of the Nazis was always, but at least we are not like the Bolsheviks. Notice how dangerous this is. If you can depict Bolshevism as this terrifying sublime, even, beyond the threshold of civilization, where it's just pure depravity and pure totalitarian collectivism, or whatever they were depicting it as, right? The Nazis did engage in a perversity of totalitarian, intrusive, invading people's privacy, not allowing them to breathe, and so on, because they were like, well, this is necessary to stop Bolshevism. To stop Bolshevism, we have to, in some ways, mimic it. But the mimicking was much more evil than the original thing. It's like a dark, twisted perverse way. Put it this way. Let's say you're depicting the Bolsheviks as the devil. What the Nazis did is they said, okay, that's a devil. We can act like devils a little bit because at least we're not like the big devil. We can be kind of small devils. At least we won't be the big scary one, right? Meanwhile, the Bolshevik caricature in their head was a complete construction of their own mind, their own sickness within. The thing that was really characteristic of Nazism was the constant state of subjective excitation and this actual destruction of civil society and privacy, ironically, which was perversion on a mass scale. Children in their families, homes, swastikas everywhere, a very alien, strange, bizarre symbol. It was like, imagine if it was pornography. It's the same level of perversion, of just lack of respect for basic dignity and privacy. And if you want to understand the difference between communism and Nazism, I think that if you look at footage from any communist state, one thing you'll notice is that there is civil society authentically, in the strict sense. I'm not talking about liberal civil society and NGOs. I'm talking about people can just chill and relax. There's an element of serenity, of contemplation, not individual contemplation like free thinking. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking that people were given the ability to breathe in their villages, in their homes. They weren't in a constant state of ideological excitation. Sometimes they're just standing around in their dachas or their apartments and they're just chilling. I mean, it's not always constant agitation, precisely. And that is very authentic because they were allowed to be human. They were allowed to actually carve out an existence that was not entirely defined by ideology, but could just be authentic, real, authentic existence in the Soviet Union and other communist states. But when you look at footage from Nazi Germany, everyone is constantly on meth all the time. There's not a single fucking moment where they're turning it off and they're ceasing to perform in this footage. They are always on meth. I thought about the difference of communism and Nazism in terms of the feelings it conjures. And this is I'm going to give you the feeling. Like Hitler's Germany, this is the vibe. Right? And then Stalin's Soviet Union, this is the vibe. There's a profound difference between these two vibes. In the Stalinist society, so to speak, there is an element of the recognition of an indecisiveness and risk in the real. Like you're building a grand factory, right? You have a plan, you have the blueprints, you're building the courage to do, but you're bracing the real. You're risking yourself. You're not acting like a god who is already it's already done being built. You have to build. You have to face a challenge. You may fail in that challenge. It's not guaranteed. So there's this type of risk you have to take. And there is a serenity there where you understood that this not necessarily, there is a timeline in which this wouldn't have had happened. Meaning it is possible that this may not happen. There is a multiplicity of possibilities and you are bracing the challenge of realizing one. But there is always a serene, sober, and wise acknowledgement of that multiplicity of possibility. Bolshevism very much did not always need to be an excited, subjective state in order to be a confident outlook. Bolshevism, you can be in an excited state, an enthusiastic state. You can have a relaxed state, a calm state, a serene and wise, far-reaching, far-seeing state. You could also even have doubts, but you really have a sense of the objective, the objective. That is the fundamental distinction in terms of the aesthetic. When I say aesthetic, I don't mean cosmetic. I mean the fundamental sensibility of human existence. A sense of the objective, a reverence and respect and humility before the objective. And in Nazism, that was the precise opposite. In Nazism, there was no sensibility of the objective. It's just a pure subjectivism and pure subjective enthusiasm without any regard. So in the Nazi mobilization, there is no possibility, there is no serenity, there is no kind of acquiescence and acknowledgement of the fact that there is an element of indecisiveness and you must be called upon to meet a challenge, and it's a real challenge. Nazism has the hubris of invincibility, that there are no challenges, that it's already overcome everything, and it's literally you're on meth. You're just in this hyper-excited state all the time. And that's not authentic because it doesn't encompass the full range of human sensibility and the human aesthetic, so to speak. communist totalitarianism was an effective reality even when people were chilling and were calm and were not thinking about ideology. But Nazism was humiliated by this element of authentic material civil society. You had to constantly be thinking about Adolf Hitler and the Führer, and the minute you're not, it's an embarrassment, you have to cover it up. And there's no ability to just chill and just like, okay, objectively we're on the right path. It doesn't depend entirely upon my subjective feeling because there's an element of objectivity there. I'll tell you, the decisiveness in Bolshevism is not a decisiveness of mustering up a subjective sensibility. It's a decisiveness of properly acquiescing to material and objective necessity. The aesthetic of Bolshevism, again, aesthetic doesn't mean cosmetic. It's a sensibility. The sensibility of Bolshevism is such, it's like a reverence of steel, right? Steel must be tempered. Steel is not automatically steel. It needs to be tempered. But will, true will, precisely consists in how the steel is tempered. Nazism is the opposite. For Nazism, will is about liquefying steel and turning it into air, turning it into the whims and fancies of the subjective, pure subjective spirit, overcoming all barriers, conquering, enslaving, destroying. The Bolshevik sensibility is about giving way to what is solid, what is concrete. Bolsheviks look upon the mountain. They revere the strength and mightiness of the mountain. The Nazis look upon nothing. They're blind. They're just perverts who are trying to affect a desire and ideology that in no way has to justify itself before material reality. So that is a fundamental difference, which is very difficult because the tricky thing is the way Nazism tried to steal and appropriate and turn into a perverse mockery of Bolshevism and the social democratic tradition in general. It was like a disgusting BDSM perverse twisting and subversion they partook in, which turned it into the opposite of what it actually meant. But you want to know what I find fascinating is that the communist rejection of fascism has nothing really in common with the bourgeois liberal one. The bourgeois liberal one is much more focused on the horror and terror of what appears to be a grand social transformation. But communists do not have that fear. And what liberals fail to understand about fascism is that the very same evil that they perceive in fascism is not a projection. It's something the Nazis themselves self-consciously were aware of and were doing purposefully. Whereas when liberals project evil upon communist states, that is really just projection. And why is that distinction important? Because liberal depictions of fascism fail to comprehend that the Nazis were also liberals who were reacting to communism, and they were just enacting all of the evil and filth, some of the evil and filth, let's say, that they projected on the Bolsheviks, the Jewish Bolsheviks, right? They said the Bolsheviks are doing all this, so in response and in retaliation, we should be able to do this twisted evil shit. But what they were accusing the Bolsheviks of was complete bullshit. You see, they projected filth on the Bolsheviks, and then through this projection, they gave themselves the green light to partake in a lot of wickedness and evil. And then liberals see that, evil from the Nazis, and somehow it turns into a form of anti-communism. It's like Nazis are holding up a warped mirror in front of communism and enacting that. Liberals are looking at that, and what do you know? Communism gets blamed for all the evil of Nazism. When the Nazis themselves were self-consciously trying to be an evil, subversive caricature of the Bolsheviks. Isn't it fascinating how that is why Hitler is someone so easy to lionize among uneducated and politically immature people who are angry at the system and want radical change? He is the caricature. He is the cosmetic performance. Everyone needs to understand something. Nazism had all of this great pageantry, all of these marches, not great in the sense of it looked good, but this grand pageantry, grand aesthetics, grand simulation and performance of a profound change happening, all to alleviate pressure that was a consequence of precisely nothing changing, really. Instead of having basic fucking nationalized healthcare, they did this incredible performative theatrics, and Hitler didn't nationalize a single fucking company in that country, not a single industry. Nothing was nationalized. Nothing was actually owned by the sovereign country, not even the banks. And yet there's this theatrics of grand change and collective solidarity going on to precisely cover up the fact, as a way of really demoralizing the workers, if anything. Nothing happening besides, of course, the violence and the terror. And it was, the whole thing was just rearmament. The whole economy was based on weapons manufacturing. The whole fucking thing. You know how these Nazis say that Hitler was giving people jobs? All the jobs were weapons manufacturing. All of them. It was all based on that. The Autobahn, again, the Autobahn was a project that began in Weimar, Germany. The whole plan for an Autobahn was in Weimar, Germany. Nothing about the Nazis. It was nothing unique. The main thing they did is rearmament. There's two traps you need to avoid. One, you need to avoid the bourgeois liberal false anti-fascism, because that is also anti-communism. When I watched that documentary last night just to see, I was like, oh my god, if they said this shit about the USSR, it would be way worse what they're trying to say. People ate together in collective mess halls, or oh, how scary. Wait until they find out about the USSR. So you need to avoid that trap. You need to avoid bourgeois liberalism when it comes to how you confidently confront fascist ideology, because the biggest friends of the resurgent neo-fascists are the liberals, and I'll tell you, the neoliberals. I'll tell you why. Because the way in which neoliberals attack fascism is, all they do is attack the superficial aspects of fascism that appeal to the common people. Collectivism, strong, powerful state, willingness to get things done when it comes to public works. But what liberals will never criticize about fascism is the evil of the subjectivism, the subjective enthusiasm, the twisted and perverted. Because you want to know why? Because fascism and Nazism, the closest thing we've gotten to it so far, I'll say it, it's literally the woke shit. The intrusive way, it's just like being, nothing's changing at the level of the relations of production or the property relations. And yet at every level of life, they're just like constantly pushing this like intrusive, hyperactive, like you're on meth, you have to constantly engage in this performative ideology. That actually has a lot in common with how Nazism was experienced. Forget the well, in this case, the content is social justice. Sure, but the form is very similar in terms of the real underlying reality of it. You just can't even breathe, or there's no authenticity at all. That's just true. Look in Ukraine. The Azov, it's not a huge leap to go from libtard and Azov in Ukraine. The problem with Bolshevism, the reason it's not as taboo and banned as Nazism, is because it's too banal and too mundane. But in actual reality, despite the fact that communism doesn't fascinate liberals as much as Nazism does, the way they react to Bolshevism is way more aggressive. That's the thing. Liberals don't react to the imagery of communism with as much hostility as they do to the imagery of communism. When a liberal sees a swastika, they're very whatever. When they see a hammer and sickle, it's not as offensive to them. But that's just about images. When it comes to reality, liberals react much more aggressively and with much more hostility to real communist phenomena and states and societies. In comparison, liberals are much more conciliatory toward Nazism and fascism as a phenomenon. Compare the way liberals accuse China of carrying out an Uyghur genocide and all these things, but they're fine with Azov Nazis in Ukraine. So you need to understand that it's not that Nazism is more dangerous to the system. It's that it tempts liberals too much, such that it is censored to some extent, not anymore on X, and it is, in terms of its images, more taboo. But in terms of its reality, it's not more taboo. It's far from it. It's much more acceptable in terms of its reality to liberals. And Kanye is a Nazi for the same reason he likes porn, okay? It's the same thing. Do not fall into the liberal temptation of assuming that the problem of fascism was just the fact that there was collectivism, because they apply that same thing against communism. Understand the distinct evil of fascism. And to understand that distinct evil, you have to be a communist. You cannot be a liberal and be a real anti-fascist. In the 30s, there were principled liberals who opposed fascism, of course. But today, what liberal means is quite different. It's the neoliberal hegemony bullshit ideologist. There's no anti-fascism from neoliberal ideology. It's not possible. These British documentaries are enabling fascism, and they are simultaneously a source of extreme anti-communism. Because the first thing someone sees who's angry at the system, who watches those documentaries, is A, if this is bad, then communism must have been way worse, and B, you know what? In comparison to the status quo, this doesn't seem so bad. So it's no wonder that, given the way the hegemony has performatively engaged in anti-fascism, they've ended up actually tempting people into fascist ideology at the expense of communism. We need to be real anti-fascists. Real anti-fascism has nothing in common with those British documentaries. Nothing. I mean, I was watching that documentary and I was going, these guys are retarded. I mean, you could tell how hard they had to try to convince themselves to regard Nazi Germany as bad. You know what sickens me to my core, guys? What sickens to me to my core about these documentaries is how they truly tried to convince us that Hitler was universally popular and universally beloved by everyone. Even though the Nazis never won an election, and even though they had to beat the shit out of an attack, all the trade unions, they beat them violently. You get taken away. And I understand he had popularity, but the way they depict it is as if there was no contradictions at all within German society. You know what I fucking hate about that documentary? They make it seem like there were no contradictions, class contradictions, in the Nazi German society, and that the only contradiction, in fact, was between people's moral conscience and their temptations to have the sense of they're like, well, you have this collective belonging and the satisfaction of these basic human needs to be together, but in doing so, you've lost your individual moral conscience and you've turned into a monster. Therefore, every collective existence is a monstrosity. And it sickens me because there were contradictions in German society. And those contradictions explain Nazi militarism. Because it was in order to alleviate the class pressure internally that they had to go outward. Does anyone seriously believe that Lebensraum was real? Let me ask you guys that. Do you think Lebensraum was real in terms of it being a real need? Lebensraum was a real policy, but do you think it was a real need? Do you really think Germany needed living space? You don't think there was enough land in Germany? Yes, there was, but there wasn't enough land and space to accommodate both the monopolists who hoarded a shit ton and common people who needed it. So instead of redistributing it, they wanted to enslave and annex and conquer other people. And that was because of an internal class pressure. Absolutely, so many people were hung because of Nazism. Every time I watch these documentaries, all they're doing is talking about how the danger of populism and people losing their moral conscience, as if it just happened because we weren't being ruled over by enough glasses wearers. Like, do you really think when Hitler was talking about Lebensraum that was real in terms of like they needed space? If Germany needed space, why doesn't Germany today need space? The biggest enabling factor in the rise of fascism is in fact liberalism. Absolutely. Absolutely. Always was.